Afternoon. Welcome to the Higher Education Budget Committee. We'll get started since it's 1:30. I'm going to depart a little bit from the agenda order just to accommodate people's different commitments and schedules across the dome. But we will begin first with any requests for bill introductions. Are there any requests for bill introductions? Okay, if not, we will move on. But before I move on, I'll ask Trevor if there are any members participating on WebEx.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a Ben Shears on WebEx.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. We'll begin our meeting today. We're going to hear a little bit more about the Community and Technical College report, which was spearheaded by, at the time, Chair Humphreys, who put a lot of time and effort into it as well. I believe Ranking Member Woodard was on that committee as well. And they have some recommendations, not only for the Kansas Legislature, but for the Kansas Board of Regents. So we want to learn a little bit more about that. And I've invited Representative Humphreys to come before the committee and share with us her thoughts. So Representative Humphreys, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman, for having me. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to just do a super high level, and I'm assuming that you all have, I don't know, I'm assuming you've seen this report, your committee and others. If you haven't, it would probably be a great idea if y'all got this report. But so the background of the report is that last year, by statute in the appropriations bill, we established a committee that was going to meet with 13 members called the Legislative Task Force on Community and Technical College State Funding. And there were legislators on that committee, but also members representing the community college, the technical colleges, and the Board of Regents, and then the legislators. And so I want to go over a little bit about what the recommendations were. I'm not going to go through all of them. There were 9 recommendations that we came up with at the end of the committee. We were offered 2 days to work on this, and we were able to get it finished in 1 day, which I think was really what the goal was. And what I want to report to you, I feel like I need to give just a little explanation. Most of you on this committee are very well aware of the how we got to this place that we even needed to have this committee, but I thought I would just, maybe for those online or for others that aren't familiar with it, just really quick explain what happened. About 10 years ago, the Board of Regents has the authority to fund the community colleges through tiered and non-tiered education and the technical schools. And tiered are technical courses that have to do with hands-on, what you would think of technical. Non-tiered is the core academics that you can get classes for. And they came up with a funding formula on how they were going to be funded, tiered and non-tiered. I'm just going to put those together just for the sake of, we're talking about funding for the technical and community colleges. And so what happened was, as we were maybe short a little bit of funds, they didn't fund exactly according to the statute. The Board of Regents came up with a formula every year by statute on how much they were going to fund. Well, we're short a little bit, so they don't fund everyone exactly up to all the courses, tiered and non-tiered. So that happened. They don't fund them completely, but then there were some schools that were funded in a year, and then if they had less students taking those sorts of classes, according to the statute, according to the formula, they should have been funded less. Like we're just going to do the formula, but we always put a proviso in the appropriations bill every year that said any school would be held harmless. So whatever they got last year, even if their enrollment went down or whatever, we're not going to let their funding go down. So it would stay even. So as it turned out, there were schools that were overfunded for the formula, and there were schools that were underfunded for the formula. And it got to be a problem, and it built up, as you can imagine, year after year. And so we really made an effort, thanks to Shirley, I'll just say, and others that put a lot of work into how can we alleviate this issue of under and overfunding, because it wasn't fair to the underfunded, and then the overfunded, it's really not fair to them either, because at some point their funding was going to drop off and we needed to just get everyone back on track. So that's what this committee was about, was how are we going to do that? And the way what started last year was we said we're going to fund everyone. Nobody is going to be underfunded. So all schools were funded at the way that they should have been. And then we said, by the statute that was in the appropriations bill, we said we're going to start backing off the schools that are overfunded, 50% this next year, and then 100% the next year. So by 2025, we are actually funding those schools according to the formula. That was the main goal. And so if you look at this list of 9 suggestions, the very bottom one, I'm going to read it. To me, this was the crux of the issue. The task force recommends the legislature ensure the recentering. Okay, recentering is a term that became really popular when it came to getting the funding all straightened out. And y'all probably heard that in your committee. But ensure the recentering of tiered and non-tiered education state aid funding occur as required in our bill 2022 House Sub for Sub SB 267. So that's kind of the crux of the issue, that the overfunded schools were going to be cut back 50% and the underfunded schools are going to be fully funded. Also, there's 8 other recommendations that I think your committee may look at. I mean, there's a lot on your plate, and so we'll see if you get some of these. I think the other one that I really want to point out is the first one, if you have the report. And it's that the task force recommends that the Board of Regents uses a 3-year average while they're figuring out what do we owe you for the tiered and the non-tiered classes and everything. Do a 3-year average instead of just the current, the previous 1 year. That would kind of ease it into. We thought that was important. I mean, some of these other ones, look at the statutory definition of new state money. Then the next one, review the current performance agreement process, which is a little bit different than other agencies that we fund. There's a performance agreement process. Fund SB 155. We talked about, we passed something last year that said that the proviso that said it had to be done within 60 days, maybe remove that proviso. Recommending auditing authority or for the funding of the schools. And we talked about that at length. I want to just highlight that a little bit. And that was, there's a point of the community college and technical schools feeling like they get their allocation and then they don't have really much recourse or accountability, or that KBOR is not exactly accountable for that funding. And so we had discussion on, I'm reading this, whether colleges have the opportunity to review their proposed funding allocation from KBOR and whether changes could be made if colleges noted any issues. That are they able to review that allocation, and are they able to make any changes? And do we need to do some sort of audit? Because in the past, that has been, some would say, lacking in this case. The task force recommends the legislature review statutes relating to residency requirements. I don't know if y'all have talked about that, but that's kind of a hot topic on some of the schools that have athletic teams, you know, who's considered a resident and who's not, and I'll let y'all get into that, but we talked at length of that you should maybe review that. The task force recommends the legislature add appropriation authority to the tiered and non-tiered funding line items, so that they could reappropriate the money. And then the proviso prohibiting KBOR from transferring money between the tiered and non-tiered. Some of this has to do with accountability to accountability for KBOR. And I will encourage you all, as you're looking at these things and as you're allocating money, as you're hearing from our universities and also even the other agencies that you're looking at, there needs to be trust between the legislature and KBOR and how we fund, how those funds are used. And if there's not trust, I would suggest that you are very specific in how you would put how the funds are used. I'm just going to leave that there, but I think more specificity is probably better. And then as the summer goes on and as the Board of Regents has meetings, there's no surprises on how things are funded because you've made it very clear what the legislative intent is. Let me just see if there is anything else, and then I'll just be open for questions, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make sure that I've covered what I wanted to cover. I think that was everything that I wanted to cover. Again, super high level, but that was the reason for the committee. I think we're on a great track. I think we're going to actually fund the formula. That's what the goal is. Do what the statutes say we should do. So I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Representative Humphreys. Appreciate your work and diligence on this effort, and we hope to continue to work on that. And so, any questions from the committee for Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Humphreys, real quick, the very first one, dealing with the 3-year rolling average, is that to mimic the K-12? And where did you guys come up with the 3-year rolling average? That way we're all kind of on the same page.
Yeah, I don't know about the K-12 funding. I don't know anything about that. It was a discussion item that was brought up, and really the whole group talked about it. What's going to be a better picture of what has actually happened with enrollment and who took those technical classes and who took the gen ed classes, and it just seemed like it was a better way to figure out who was, how much they actually are spending on those classes rather than a 1-year snapshot. And I don't know about K-12.
Thank you. And a follow up, and it may be for our fiscal analysts in the end. But for total enrollment, are we counting high school kids who are already paid for? So forth. That way I kind of have a full understanding. Because I know, for instance, in high school, I took a couple college courses that I think that my community college was getting credit for. That may be a question for the for research.
Yes, I am sure looking at. I will say, I think what the answer is they're looking at the enrollment of each of those classes, tiered and non-tiered. So the age of the person, I don't think that's my understanding. I'm not sure if Shirley has a different understanding. Okay, she's thinking.
Perhaps we can circle back to that.
Okay.
That answer later in the meeting today. Are there any other questions? Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just a clarifying question, I think, of the last question. So remind me if I'm remembering this correctly, but I think the conversation around the 3-year rolling average was to kind of make the funding less volatile to a point where people are not being so over and underfunded, and we're getting them to a point that is more in line with
evens out a little bit. Yeah. Yep. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I would imagine in a year like we had with COVID and how disruptive that was to everybody, having a 3-year rolling average would have a little bit of reduce that volatility, as Representative Woodard indicated. We will jump back to that question a little bit later in the meeting, but I do have another speaker coming up.
great.
Is there anything else?
No, I hope you all have looked at this and that you all have looked at the recommendations and that you'll follow through with whatever seems appropriate for your committee. And I hear your new chairman is doing a great job. I know he's jumped right in. So happy for that. So, okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, Representative Humphreys. Really appreciate your participation here today, and we'll be in touch because I'm sure I'll have questions for you later on as we move through the committee process. Next, I'm going to jump over to down on the agenda to the Midwest Higher Education Compact. I'm delighted to have with us today the president, Susan Heegard from Minnesota, and is visiting us here in Kansas today. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Is it on? Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name's Susan Heegard, and I just arrived this morning here with my colleague from the Compact, Rob Trembath, who's our COO and General Counsel. I'm going to talk kind of quick here because we're expected at a hearing in the other body in Senator Baumgartner's committee shortly, but I'm happy to answer questions later. We're here until late in the afternoon tomorrow. So if you'd like to follow up with me, please feel free to check in. The compact was legislatively created in 1991 through the Council of State Governments, a Midwest Legislative Conference. And there are 12 states. It's the Midwest Census Region. We're one of 4 regional compacts. There's one in the West, one in the Northeast, and one in the South. And the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York feel that they don't really need to be part of a compact, so they're not. We're governed by 60 commissioners and some alternates. Representative Rogers is one of our commissioners, as is Blake Flanders, who heads up obviously the Board of Regents office. And Kansas was one of the very first members back in 1990. We ask for a state commitment from each state of $115,000. And after I walk through some of the slides here, I hope you'll see that there's a pretty good return on investment for your state. This is just a beautiful capital. I have to confess, I visit all 12 state capitals during the best time of the year here in the Midwest. I also drove through here when our daughter finished college in California the day before Christmas Eve. And so I experienced some fabulous Midwest weather then as well, but it's a lovely capital. As you can see on the slides here, there are 7 commissioners. Representative Ballard is our actually vice chair of the compact. She'll be the chair in the coming year. And they trade off between Republican and Democrat. So there's a flip each year. Senator Baumgartner, Dr. Flanders, Dr. Lee, she's a new commissioner with the Board of Regents. Mr. Aaron Otto, who I understand you grew up with, and Senator Francisco, and then also Representative Rogers. So what I like about the job, my background's in state government. I worked for 2 of our governors and 1 of our senators in Washington. I was in Washington and I worked on Senator Kassebaum's education committee many, many years ago. But what I like is that it's a balance of higher ed leaders and legislators and governors advisors. So it's an interesting mix of folks that wouldn't typically kind of come together to focus on kind of the value proposition for post-secondary education in your state. So I think of that, with the compact, we have kind of 2 sides of our business. One is our cost savings programs and contracts. The other is our policy and research. And if you join the compact, you get to take advantage of all or none. It's like a menu. So you can pick and choose what you'd like to participate in. We have cost savings programs and contracts, mainly technology, but also student health insurance. We have policy related programs. You're a big participant in the credentialing work, as well as open education resources. And we produce a number of research reports, and some of that data has been provided with you here today. So in the slide deck that you have, I thought maybe it would be up, but I guess you can just look at the slides that I've handed out. How many of you know what attainment is? Have you heard of the term attainment? So attainment is sort of the educatedness or the workforce readiness of your state. And the Lumina Foundation out of Indiana has worked hard on this to try to figure out what are the credentials beyond high school that a state has. And your state tracks above the national average slightly. About 55% of your folks have a post-secondary certificate or higher. And folks around the country are getting a lot better at counting and figuring out what a certificate is and what it means. Can it stack? Does it lead to a good job? And credentials broadly. So your state is tracking above the national average, but given sort of what's happening with demographics and the workforce needs, we all need to do better than that. And I say that in every single state. It's important to kind of keep striving across the board. You want techs and you want doctors. So it's important to focus broadly. The next slide, I think, is an important one because it is slide number 8, I believe, and that breaks down the attainment level for your state. I'm not going to weed through all the details here, but it really does show you, for example, what percentage of your folks have less than a high school diploma, what percentage have a high school diploma or the equivalent, and some college or no credential, et cetera, et cetera. One of the important places I believe to focus, and what some of the experts will say, is on that category of some college and no credential. A number of states have focused hard on this. I know Indiana, for example, they really put forth an effort called You Can Go Back. And they found people that had some college or some education and then went back and found them and tried to figure out, did they want to get a technical degree or something like that or beyond. And so there's some interesting efforts going around the state, but really understanding your data, I feel, is important because it allows you to figure out where you want to focus. I have a number of slides following shortly on finance, and I'm going to just kind of cruise through those. But it is also important with respect to data that you look at your overall population trends and what's happening in the state. So one of the slides that we prepared for you, slide 9, there are gaps in the proportion of adults with an associate's degree or higher in Kansas. And the gap is between underrepresented minority students and white adults. So as you know, the demographics are shifting. So failure is expensive. So figuring out how to invest and get good ROI for the state, but for each individual person, is really critical. So having that data at your fingertips is helpful. On slide 10, I've tried to illustrate for you the population trend in general. This is pretty much the case across the Midwest. If you go to Texas or California, well, maybe not California now, but Texas, Arizona, and those states, you'll see increase in population. But here in the Midwest, by and large, you'll see the population in general flattening. You'll see a flattening or a decline in the number of white high school graduates, and the population that's growing tends to be minority and underrepresented students. In yours, that it tends to be flat, but in many states, like in Illinois, it's growing quite robustly. On slide 11, we've provided undergraduate enrollment information, and I think that's an important one. There's this data lag, so this only includes about the first year of COVID, 2021. So one thing that you probably all know is that during a recession in most years, you'd see enrollment tick up and increase at community colleges and tech colleges. But that wasn't the case right now. And so in talking with some of the folks here, your public two-year institutions, the techs and the community colleges are merged here. The numbers may even be deeper for the community colleges, the two-year institutions, in terms of decline. So folks all around the country are trying to figure out what the heck's happening. Why aren't they going back? Are they working and not going to college? Are they delaying it? And how much of an impact did COVID have on those decisions? So I think that's another piece of data that's just helpful to look at. The next 6 slides focus on the total price of attendance, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. One of the challenges here, and I've talked to a number of folks about these slides, is that because there's a data lag, it doesn't include the Promise Scholarship, which is so remarkable for the two-year institution. So your comparisons when you're looking at your border states, which we've put in here, and the Midwest and the national, you'd look a lot better, at least for two-year institutions, because that Promise Scholarship hasn't yet been included in the data. It probably would be next year. But as you know, that's a last pay scholarship that's really been very beneficial, will be very beneficial for many students. So on the 2-year slide 12, it would show that the tuition fees, room and board, and the reason the tuition and fees are in there, it's sort of an average of what the cost of living is for that institution. And again, the community and the techs are merged together here, but it's lower than the national average, but higher than the price in most of your border states. So we feel like when we do these presentations, it's important to look at the border states as well as the Midwest and the rest of the states. We also looked at four-year institutions, and this, lumps them all together. So there's, some variation there. It's an average. And so those tuition fees, room and board at the 4 years is lower than the Midwest and national averages and lower than the price in most of the border states. The average state grant. So we look at grant aid. For example, Minnesota is a high tuition, high grant state. We have a very robust state grant program there. States have different approaches to this. So here for the 2-year colleges, again, this is really going to be affected once that Promise Scholarship is added in. And then my understanding also is that because the tech colleges and the community colleges are included, there's a little bit of an adjustment that we need to look at because there isn't local funding for some of those 2-year institutions. So jumping forward to slide 15, the average state grant for students at public 4-year institutions is lower in Kansas than the border states and lower than the Midwest and national averages. But I think what's really important is to look at the net effect of the tuition and the grants and the other appropriations. So on slide 16, we show the average net price, the total cost of attendance minus grant aid for students across income categories at Kansas public 2-year institutions. And they're above the Midwest and national averages and higher than the prices in the border states. And again, once that Promise Scholarship gets factored in, we'd see those numbers change. So I'm excited to see what it looks like next year. For the 4-year institutions that average for students across income categories, again, above the Midwest and national averages and higher than the prices in the border states. So there's more. We're gonna have a conversation tonight at dinner and then with the Board of Regents tomorrow and with a number of members. If there are questions and more digging and follow-up that we need to do, we're certainly happy to do that. But we just wanted to provide you with a picture of the data. So the next slides, this is a pretty good story for you. The out-migration of first-time students increased slightly between 2018 and 2020 in Kansas, but decreased in most of the border states. So your out-migration increased slightly. That may not sound like good news, but just wait. On the next slide, you'll see that the in-migration increased for the most part, although it decreased between 2018 and 2020 in all states. And the good news for you is that if you look at slide 20, more students migrate into Kansas than the number that migrate out. Kansas and its border states, except for Colorado, which is always different, have had a positive net in migration. So Kansas looks great. Missouri looks pretty good, but you really shine when it comes to that net effect of your in and out migration, which is good news for you. That last slide, 21, is really busy, but what I like about it is that it basically shows you who stays in, who goes out but stays in the Midwest, and then who leaves the Midwest completely. So if you look at Kansas, that is 1, 2, 3 kind of spaces in, you'll see that your percentage of students who tend to stay in Kansas is high. Your students that migrate out, if they go out, they go to the rest of the Midwest. They might hop across the border to Missouri or Nebraska. And then very few of your states travel outside of the Midwest. So that's good news. So I just wanted to provide you with a synopsis, kind of quick picture of, your involvement in the compact and some of the data that we have to share. One of the things that I wanted to just highlight, going back to the savings, is that, where did I put that? Kansas has a really good ROI when it comes to the $115,000 commitment, and that comes through the Board of Regents office. In 2022, your colleges, universities, school districts, state and local governments, and all of those public entities can take advantage of our contracts, bulk purchasing, realize more than $3.48 million in cost savings. So that's a good chunk of change. And that's based upon $20 million in hardware, software, and service contracts. You also are part of the Midwest Student Exchange Program. So your citizens, it's not a savings to the state, but your citizens have saved money through the student exchange program. And I think that there is also participation in some of our student health programs. Kansas used to participate in the property insurance program and no longer does. But we really enjoy our relationship with the state and look forward to additional connections. Thank you.
Thank you, President Heegard, for being here today and your overview of the Midwest Higher Education Compact. I did have one question before you have to go off to the Senate Education Committee. Are there any services that you provide as it relates to cybersecurity? And the reason I ask that is because there are so many requests coming in as we look at the overall state budget for cybersecurity. So is there anything that you guys offer?
So, Mr. Chair and members, we do have a cybersecurity insurance program. It's not heavily used right now, but a number of institutions are taking another look at that. So we're kind of reframing our focus on risk management. And so while we're not going to have a full-blown property insurance program, we are going to be providing, we hope, a focus on terrorism, on fine arts, and builder's risk. Plus, we'd also are looking at, the commitment, the interest in cybersecurity. So that's something that we're involved with. I think one of the nice things about our organization is, we are not afraid to try stuff and we're not afraid to wind stuff down. So when we saw that the property insurance program wasn't kind of serving its purpose any longer for all sorts of reasons, we began to wind that down. But we're very interested in figuring out and we've heard that there's interest in cybersecurity.
Any other questions from the committee? I did see one of the fellow commissioners on the Higher Education Compact here, Representative Rajas. I hope you'll represent the legislature well at dinner tonight. No comment? Okay. Yeah.
President, thanks for being here. I apologize when you try to do three different things. In fact, I got to leave too, and probably when you do. I got another speaking engagement. If you're not aware, do a little deep dive into this. There's a lot of numbers, and I would guess I would probably be a skeptic when first coming on this committee a few years ago to see for sure. And if you don't know, we were living in Siberia, some call it Nebraska, when my daughter went to school at K-State, and because of this program, we were able to not have to pay all the out-of-state tuition, so it worked. But the services that you provide all the institutions is I think still think it's a good investment for us to do. And the other thing and I apologize, I probably not been the best commissioner of all with everything going on, but Representative Ballard has represented us well on a number of different occasions. And if I understand right, I think I am finally the voting delegate because of COVID and everything. It's finally my turn. So, but anyway, it is good, and hopefully you have meetings tomorrow with some of the folks to talk about this and then answer their questions. But it does play a role, and sometimes we like to be out on an island ourselves and think we can do it without other help. But this is one of those that is a good investment, and that and it works well, and it is not only bipartisan. As long as K-State gets more than KU. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that way. It's not that way at all. But I believe you'll find that every institution, especially our Regis institutions, can glean something from this. So this is a good thing that we're involved in. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, one more thing I just add to that point. If you go onto our website, mec.org, you'll see that there's a Kansas-specific location on the website, and in there you can actually dig in and like down to the school district or the local unit of government, the fire station, the water, where you can see what contracts your state uses. And and programs as well. So there's some good information on the website as well as other resources too.
Thank you very much, President
you.
Egard. Glad you could join us. And how long were you going to be around tomorrow?
Mr. Chair, we're around until around 4 o'clock when we have to head back to the airport.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. So shifting gears a little bit, we'll head back over to the Legislative Task Force report, which was discussed earlier by Representative Humphreys. Brianna, would you like to do your report now? And if you have any questions, anybody on the committee, I'd like to try to keep it informal. So just let me know if you have any questions and we can kind of go through it as questions arise. Thank you.
Okay, you guys have this handout, which is what I'm going to be reading from. And then I also have this handout, which goes over the cost model. So if we have questions about the cost model, I will defer to K-Board to get some clarification on those things. So the task force was charged with studying the provisions of state funding to the community and technical colleges in Kansas under provisions in the 2022 appropriations bill, section 109G, House Senate Bill 267. The task force met on August 30th, 2022. And I'm going to skip over that recommendations page and get right to that background page. So the task force was comprised of 13 members, one of those being Representative Woodard. Others included 3 members representing the community colleges appointed by the Kansas Association of Community College Trustees, 2 members representing the technical colleges, and 1 member from the Board of Regents. The 2022 appropriations bill required the task force to review the provisions for the state funding for community and technical colleges concerning the post-secondary tiered technical education state aid and non-tiered course credit hours granted from section 109. The provisions state that the legislative intent for fiscal year 2024 is to implement the funding formula for community and technical colleges concerning the post-secondary tier technical education state aid and non-tiered course credit hours, so that the community and technical colleges that were overfunded according to the formula in fiscal year 2023 will receive 50% of that amount of the overfunding in fiscal year 2024. So I'm going to,
Brianna, I had a question.
Okay.
Is that in the governor's recommendation, the 50%? I didn't know if.
I will follow up with you.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to go to the bottom on the right and do an overview of the 2-year college state aid funding model. Funding for the provisions of the general education and technical course is determined using the cost model required by state law. Funding for technical education takes into account additional costs to deliver those courses. The cost calculation model is based on numerous factors and is set by the Board of Regents. The non-tiered course credit hour grant is also set by the Board of Regents. The revisers noted in the appropriations from fiscal year 2023, to the tiered was 66 million and non-tiered was 95 million. Additionally, the legislature directed K-Board to distribute funding in fiscal year 2023 so that each institution would receive no less than what they received in fiscal year 2022, with the directive that by fiscal year 2025, the funding formula will be fully implemented. So that's what Representative Humphreys was kind of talking about earlier. Between fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2025, funds will be recentered among the institutions to ensure that each school is funded according to the cost model. And then I'm going to turn over to page 3 that says calculations of the cost model. For every tiered course, 4 factors determine the course rate: instructor costs, instructional support costs, institutional costs, and extraordinary costs for equipment and infrastructure. Non-tiered courses have 3 factors of course rates: instructor costs, instructional support costs, and institutional support costs. The course rate is then multiplied by the number of eligible student credit hours to calculate the total course costs. The committee discussed increased fiscal year 2023 tiered and non-tiered appropriations by the legislature and the provisos creating the recentering of the funding process so that all colleges are funded according to the formula in fiscal year 2025. The committee also discussed the three main funding sources of community colleges, which is local property taxes, tuition, and state aid. And the technical colleges operate with two main funding sources, which is tuition and state aid. Then we're going to move down to the bottom where it says institutional performance agreements. Let's be very brief. So K-Board's charged with supervising performance measures, and the colleges were asked to develop institutional improvement plans showing how the performance indicators would be implemented and measured by each school. 3 of the measures are chosen by each college from a list provided by Kansas Board of Regents. The other 3 measures are created by each college, and the school must meet 4 of those 6 measures. I'm going to flip to page 4 and briefly discuss those residency requirements. So the basic requirement for Kansas student residency is for a student to live in the state for 6 months prior to enrollment. And then there's some exceptions for military students. Other factors colleges can consider for aid purposes include home ownership in Kansas, Kansas income taxes, and registration to vote in Kansas. The committee discussed technical colleges. The committee discussed that technical colleges do not count students who drive from another state as residents for purposes of state aid, but if those students choose to move and reside in Kansas in either a dorm or apartment, then they are considered residents. So that was a very brief overview. I won't read all of the recommendations to you unless you would like me to. So I'll stand for questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brianna. Questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You probably don't have the answer to this, but how likely is this going to be implemented?
Mr. Chair, I don't have an answer for that.
They spent a lot of time and brought a lot of people together. It just seems like it would be a shame if it was dismissed. I think they came up with some really good decisions to try to make things more equitable. So if you can find out, I'd love that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So Representative Wassinger, if I could just comment on your question, that's something I think we need to establish kind of what the will of the committee is on some of these recommendations. So I would welcome a discussion here today about, how we move forward, whether it's, is there something in statute we need to change? Is it a proviso? What is it that we need to do to make these changes? So I would encourage you guys to let me know what your input is. Vice Chair Blue, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to kind of follow up on what Representative Wassinger said. And maybe my question is for the reviser. Of these 9 conclusions and recommendations, how many of them are statute oriented? How many are proviso oriented? How many of them are through the budget? Because I think that's what's going to be really helpful for us to see is the formula, and I'm brand new to this committee, is the formula through statute? Do we need to address the formula through legislation? What is the true issue? How do we get to it? And I think that's what I'm kind of curious. I did find it interesting, but then again, Representative Humphreys did say that they met in a day, not the 2 days. I am interested that there's no proposed legislation. So I see these recommendations, but then no action afterwards. So I want to make sure that we take up that action as a committee.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blue. And that is certainly something I need to visit with our reviser, who is not with us right now, because we are not taking any action on any bills today. So she stepped out to attend to another committee or commitment. But yeah, that's certainly something we need to identify. Representatives Chuck Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Young lady on residency requirements. junior college, the basic requirement for Kansas students is to live in the state for 6 months. Now, if they don't meet that requirement, is tuition higher, or they just can't get grants or scholarships or so forth?
I can follow up with clarity because I don't want to give you, I have a general understanding, but I want to be clear about what the 6 months mean and what they mean moving forward.
One other question, I hope it's a good question. We met with the junior college presidents down in Southeast Kansas, and I think the new rule is like a football team can bring 30 out of state football players in. Now, if they bring 30 out of state football players, are they paying the same as a Kansas resident, or what is the rules on that?
I will follow up on
Thank
that
you.
as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Smith, I'm a new member of this committee as well, so I'm learning a lot. But in the preparations today, there was a report talking about the legislative post audit. And I believe there's going to be a report or some sort of audit that focuses on athletics at two-year colleges, community colleges. So I don't know in terms of how in depth they'll get in answering those questions, but it sounds like it has elevated to become an issue enough that they're going to warrant a study on. So Representative Woodard, did you have a comment, question?
A stab at answering Representative's question. I believe if they meet the 6-month residency requirement, then they become in-state. The difference between community colleges and the technical colleges is that from community colleges, if it's a resident, they're splitting the tuition, the cost of education, 1/3 from the local taxing entity, 1/3 from the state, 1/3 of tuition. I believe if they're out of state, they're paying 2/3 tuition, 1/3 from. Our resident expert is in the room.
Thank you, Representative Woodard. I know we have representatives here from the community colleges as well as Kansas Board of Regents. So if there's anybody that would like to speak to that, I would welcome them to the dais.
Hello, I'm Elaine Frisbee. I'm Vice President for Finance and Administration at the Board of Regents, and we are the entity responsible for administering these state funds to the two-year schools. With regard to residency rules, there are 3 standards, some of which are embedded in statute. First, for state universities, you must be a resident for a year prior to gaining residency. If you come to Kansas, and even if you are enrolled and living here for your term here, you never become a resident for tuition purposes. For your two-year schools, the tech colleges, you can be designated a resident on day 1. So there is no 6-month wait as there is in statute, and I'm thinking it's 71406 KSA that says you have to wait 6 months before you can become a resident. So when we collect enrollment data from the schools, we identify there is a flag that says this student is a non-resident, this student is a resident. It's important for state aid purposes to consider who is a resident because state aid only goes for those students who are Kansas residents. So I hope that helps. For the tech colleges who have no property tax authority, they are not, they have no in-district elected representatives to administer tax dollars. They can identify someone from day 1, although they will tell you that, I know Ben Shears is on the call, if they have someone who is living in another state, their residence is in Nebraska, and they're driving to a tech college, they are a non-resident. They have to have a Kansas address.
Thank you. Heather, did you have a comment as well in addition to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify also the in-state and out-of-state issue. Elaine did a good job clarifying how the state aid portion works, but for tuition, which I think was your other question, most of the community college have an out-of-state tuition rate, an in-district tuition rate, and then an out-of-district Kansas rate. And they're all a little bit different. And so you were right about the Jayhawk conference has changed the rules over time about how many out-of-state athletes. And just for the committee's knowledge, all of our community colleges have athletics, and one technical college also has athletics.
Thank you for those comments. Other questions? Okay, seeing none. Any comments? Any comments from members of the committee about how we proceed? Because we do have some marching orders if we'll take them. Some of those recommendations are for us specifically as the legislature. So I think Representative Humphreys pointed at the first one, which is, I think, the first one she talked about was the 9th recommendation. And so that talks about ensuring the recentering of tiered and non-tiered education state aid. So I need to visit with the revisor to see if there's, in addition to what's in statute, if we need to make any modifications to that. And I believe there probably is, but if you'd like to come up to speak about that, yeah.
Sorry for that. I would like to clarify. So there are statutes that govern how we administer state aid to the schools. And there have been provisos placed in the appropriation bills on the subject. Our agency has always 100% followed those statutes and those provisos. And we will continue to do so. So last session, the 2022 legislature adopted a proviso telling us to recenter the state funds. And so that is what we will do. And that is not something that has to be embedded in the governor's budget, because that has been already enacted by the 2022 legislature.
Thank you for your feedback. Did you have a question, Vice Chair?
No, not a question. I just have a request for the revisor's office or the research. Thank you. My mind just went blank. I would be interested to see in statute what the formulas are in statute, because I know there is it's way confusing for everything that I've learned in the past month over all of this, but I'd like to see what is written in statute just so I can fully understand how everything works through KBOR and so forth.
Thank you. And Brianna, if you would, going down the list of recommendations and working with Jill, our committee revisor, to determine from her perspective what needs modification in statute and what does not. Thank you. And I needed to be reminded, and thank you, Phyllis, for reminding me that we do have another guest appearing via WebEx. The president of the Northwest Technical College, Ben Shears, is joining us.
Hello, hello. Can you see me, hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay.
President Shears.
Great, thank you. So apologies for not being in there in person. We're still digging out from 9 to 10 inches of snow out here over the course of this weekend. So,
President Shears.
Yes, can you hear me?
We're going to try to get the volume up just a little bit before you get into your remarks. Can you turn it up on your side, President?
Yeah, let me see if I can turn that up a little bit.
Or can you get closer to your microphone?
You bet. How's that? Better?
Yeah, that's a little bit better.
Okay. I'll keep trying to test this here and see if this works.
Thank you.
You bet. If this works okay right here, I'll kind of rock and roll. Really appreciate again getting the chance to kind of visit a little bit. Representative Humphreys did an exceptional job, I thought, this summer, working on some issues that are certainly sticky wickets, and she did a good job of herding the cats in the room. We had quite a few really interesting topics to kind of discuss. I'll kind of touch just really quickly on a few of the points that were brought up in the committee. On the out-of-state tuition piece, when it comes to differential tuition amongst the technical colleges right now, those are for most, if not all of us, flat, whether it's an in-state, out-of-state, or international. And I think that's something we're discussing in-house as a result of the task force this summer. So I think there was some really good conversation in regard to that. I'm kind of a history guy, so I like to give a little bit of context when it comes to the residency piece. And I think quite a few of the task force recommendations that came out of there were very supportive of as a sector with the tech colleges. Probably the biggest one that we are concerned about, however, really runs with the residency piece. And just a short background on this, the technical colleges in the state of Kansas historically reported within the structure of KSDE. We were part of school districts in the past for most of us. So if you think about how school districts are funded, in the past, if you had a student who moved to town, you got a new family that moves to town, that local school district was funded based on day one, who they had in their seats in that school district in those classes. When the technical colleges reported under the school districts, that was how the technical colleges were funded. About mid-2000s or so, there was a change at that point in time, particularly around that point, in which technical colleges were encouraged and moved out of the local school districts, the last of them were, and required to either affiliate or merge with a community college or university or become separate standalone institutions. And so at that juncture, over that time, nothing really changed in the practice of funding from the residency standpoint. And so just a little bit of historical context, that's where the residency piece originates from, and why technical colleges in the past and currently today are funded on day one when a student moves to the community and begins taking classes at the technical colleges. As was already mentioned, the community colleges have to wait 6 months. Universities residency is a year. So there is a difference there. As was also highlighted, one of the reasons why that residency, my understanding in talking to folks from around the state, one of the reasons that wasn't changed when the technical colleges moved out from under the local school districts was in acknowledgement of the fact that the technical colleges do not have a local mill. There is no way to offset those additional expenses. We don't have a local levy that we can raise or lower as needed within our local communities. So when it comes to the residency, and the reason I'm pretty passionate about this particular piece, is when you look at the in-state, out-of-state enrollments across the technical colleges in the state of Kansas, the one institution that this impacts is mine at Northwest Tech. We're one of the smallest institutions in the state. Pure geography, we're 17 miles from the state of Colorado and about 45 from the state of Nebraska. So we do have a tendency, just because of sheer geography, to draw students from both in-state and out-of-state to our campus. A lot of the work, however, we do is to try to transition those students who go through technical education in particular into Kansas workforce employment. It's a critical piece of what we do and why we exist. And so we're keenly aware of the residency conversation. For my institution, I'll tell you this: if the residency ends up changing and we have to match what the community colleges have for residency, for my local little institution, that's anywhere between a $500,000 to $600,000 impact. Again, being a small institution like mine, that's about a 17% hit on state aid within the state of Kansas, and representative of about 10 jobs and about 14% of my local workforce at the college. So it's significant. It's not small in my book at all. So we watch this closely. I think, again, I mentioned, the biggest thing with this residency piece is we don't have the local mill levy to offset. We are also funded a little differently when it comes to the 2/3, 1/3 that was brought up just a little bit ago. Right now, the technical colleges receive 2/3 funding or 2/3 reimbursement on courses taught from the state in the form of state aid. The other 1/3 comes from student tuition and fees. On the community college side of things, of course, it's 1/3 student tuition and fees, 1/3 state aid, and 1/3 from the local mill. However, that's only the case in situations where you have in-district students. So in-district students at a community college would be students who live within the home county of where the community college resides. out-district students, so if you have a student who's attending a community college from another county in the state, out-district students receive 2/3 funding, which is the same as the technical colleges. So it's a really interesting model that we work through, that we all navigate in the two-year sector when it comes to funding in the state. And so it's very difficult to make this an apples to apples comparison when we're talking about residency between the two sectors, as well as how each are funded. So just wanted to provide a really quick overview in regard to that, kind of wind down my comments. I think one of the biggest challenges we have as a state, and I think some would say that the two greatest exports we have are commodities and kids. As was highlighted earlier, we still do have a significant number of students who migrate out of the state for either higher education purposes or employment outside of the state of Kansas. It's encouraging to hear that we have a number that we're importing as well. There's some really good data out there right now with the impending enrollment cliff that's about to hit us in about 2028, 2029. And if you're not familiar with this, it's something that I would certainly encourage you to read up on. 2008, 2009 was the Great Recession, of course, and we saw birth rates across the country decline dramatically. That has not rebounded. Those students are due to hit our classrooms in just a handful of years, again, 2028, 2029. They're calling for, at this point, projecting about a 15% reduction in college going rate. Those are going to hit our campuses really hard all across the state, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in. And so as I kind of look at this landscape looking ahead, really what we need to begin doing is really putting together a state plan and an initiative in order to import more students, because at this point, we have a lot of really positive things happening within the Kansas workforce. We don't have nearly enough individuals to work the jobs. We need to focus on how we import more individuals, whether it be students into our higher education system or employers into the workforce, to be able to address the needs that we see rising. And so, I would much rather see us versus, looking at changing residency or reducing funding to institutions who do really good work. Instead, seeing the sectors work together to figure out how in the world we can collectively address what's coming down the road here in just a very short amount of time. So I'll pause there. Thank you for letting me jump on today to talk about tech ed. I think we're very proud of the sector work we do. And I'll proudly say that we have the highest return on investment of any sector in higher education in the state of Kansas. And so we're pleased to be able to present today. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Excuse me. Thank you, President Shears, for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate your remarks. Any questions for President Shears? Since I have you online, I'll ask you one. Do you have many Colorado license plates in your parking lots there in Northwest Tech?
So that's a mixed bag of an answer. Being 17 miles from the state of Colorado, I will tell you this. COVID did more for local economic development and home sales than I think any effort within the region could have done. We have had a lot of in-migration of Colorado residents moving to Western Kansas, which I think is exciting for us. The political environment in the state of Colorado, as well as the regulatory environment, has also been beneficial. We have 2 new companies that we're working with right now in Sherman County who moved their initial launch over to the state of Kansas due to the regulatory environment and political environment within the state of Kansas, or within the state of Colorado, rather. So I would say in that regard, yes, it's been certainly a positive thing for the state of Kansas there. We'll keep as many Colorado businesses and community members coming into our great state as we possibly can. But to the point on the enrollment side of things, Elaine nailed it down really well, that if we have a Colorado student who lives in Burlington, Kansas, which is just over the border, if they live and reside in the state of Colorado, they are not counted for aid. They are not counted as an in-state resident at Northwest Tech. So maybe kind of a twofold answer there.
Thank you, President Shears. Any other questions? If not, thank you for joining the committee today virtually, and I'm glad that you reported that you received some good moisture out there. So
yes, much needed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other comments or anything about the task force recommendations and moving forward? I'll work with the revisor to get some more information about kind of next steps. If we wanted to pursue these recommendations, what we would need to do as a committee, and I'll get that to you as soon as possible. I will be in full light of being, I guess, transparent. I'll be meeting with Senator Bellinger tomorrow morning to discuss kind of what they're doing on the Senate side as it relates to higher ed budget, just getting a feel for what they're doing and seeing if our efforts can kind of align in some ways. So any announcements? If not, that'll conclude today's meeting. I appreciate everybody's involvement and participation. And tomorrow we will not be meeting, but we will meet again on Thursday at 1:30. All right, we'll see you then.